Do you really believe that sex is just pleasure? Carl Jung would say that this belief is the most comfortable prison of the male mind. And when you stop, it's not the body that feels it first. It's the soul. Society taught you to chase pleasure as a sign that everything's okay. They sold you the idea that a fulfilled man is one who has constant access to sex. And you believed it, because everyone does. But what happens when, by choice or circumstance, sex stops? When your body no longer connects physically with another? When there's no touch, no release, and the cycle ends? A certain quiet emptiness begins, an inner discomfort. But it's not just abstinence. It's not mild, it's deeper. Jung would say it's the shadow rising, because everything you used to numb with pleasure now surfaces. Your insecurities, your needs, your truths. Constant sex is often the emotional crutch of the modern man. He doesn't want connection. He wants internal silence. An orgasm is one of the fastest ways to shut the mind off, to silence the inner chaos. But when you stop, the mind starts screaming again. And what does it scream? That you were never truly at peace. You were just sedated. Jung saw desire as a symptom of the psyche, something that reveals far more than just instinct. What you desire, how you desire, who you desire. All of that says more about your wounds than your wants. And when you remove pleasure, only the mirror remains, and mirrors are cruel to those not ready to face themselves. That's why this video isn't about celibacy. It's not about chastity. It's about awareness, understanding what sex has done for you, and what it's been hiding from you. Because when you stop, the truth shows up, and most men are not ready for it. Carl Jung said, "We are not enlightened beings trying to become human. We are humans trying to become conscious. And nothing exposes our unconsciousness more than sexual desire. Desire is the language of the shadow. It is the hidden voice that reveals what the ego tries to hide. When a man desires, he's unknowingly trying to complete a part of himself that feels broken. The problem is, he projects this onto bodies, onto faces, onto fantasies. He believes that she will fix something inside him, that night will heal an old wound. But Jung warned, what you seek in another is what you lack in yourself. And until you face that, you'll keep running in circles. When you stop having sex, you stop feeding the illusion of wholeness. And what's left? The shadow. It starts showing up in your dreams, in irritations, in old memories you thought you had outgrown. It's not punishment, it's revelation. You begin to realize that a lot of what you called lust was actually escape, a way to manage your anxiety, to escape the void. And that void, it's not sexual, it's existential. It's the echo of parts of you that you abandoned, neglected, ignored. Jung said the shadow contains everything you refuse to be, but still lives within you. And when you stop having sex, those parts have nowhere left to hide. They come up. They demand attention. They demand integration. Many men enter abstinence expecting strength, but before strength comes pain. Because it's painful to realize you built your identity around sexual validation, that your self-worth was always tied to who you could conquer, and now, without that, you must learn to see yourself differently. That's the starting point, the beginning of the real inner journey. Because the man who faces his shadow faces his power. Not the power to seduce, but the power to possess himself. And that is the first step to being free. The first thing you feel when you stop having sex is not peace. It's restlessness. It's like turning off loud music you didn't even notice anymore. The silence feels deafening. But that silence is not emptiness. It's revelation. Without sex, the world becomes clearer. You start to see the people you kept around out of convenience. You notice the relationships you maintained out of neediness. You begin to realize that much of your conversations, your intentions, your behaviors, all revolved around one hidden agenda: to be wanted, to be accepted, to be desired. When sex is removed from the equation, you see how much it occupied your mind, how much you thought, acted, dressed, and even worked for the promise of future sexual validation. You start to ask yourself, who am I when I'm not trying to be desired? And that's when the noise fades and the truth appears. The truth about you, about your fears, about your choices. The truth about how much you've been avoiding yourself, distracting yourself, numbing yourself. Abstinence reveals, and that revelation, though uncomfortable, is powerful. Jung believed the psyche cannot stand a vacuum. When you take sex out, something has to take its place, and that's when you choose. Either you sink into new distractions, or you dive into yourself. The first days without sex are a test. The mind tries to bargain. It starts justifying relapses, creating excuses, dramatizing the isolation. But if you resist, something begins to organize within you. A clarity, almost cruel, emerges. You start to see people with new eyes. You see yourself more honestly, without the filter of desire. You see the truth. And yes, many times it's not pretty, but it's liberating. Because for the first time, you're truly seeing yourself. Without dopamine, without craving, without fantasy. Just you with you. And that, though lonely, is the beginning of clarity. When a man stops having sex, he's not just walking away from pleasure. He's walking away from the mirror that used to define his worth. For years, maybe decades, the female gaze worked as a thermometer for the male ego. It was through her desire that he measured his worth. It was through conquest that he confirmed his existence, and when that gaze disappears, the ego goes into withdrawal too. Jung said the ego seeks to perpetuate its image, and in the modern man, that image is often tied to being desired. How many times have you felt more of a man just because you were noticed, chosen, complimented, smiled at? Now imagine taking all of that out of the equation. Imagine living without that invisible applause. It's unsettling, because the ego doesn't know how to stand on its own. It needs a stage, an audience. And when you step away from the seduction dynamic, the ego panics. It says you're fading, that you're wasting time, that you're becoming invisible. But it's in this exact moment that you have a chance to discover something deeper. Self-worth, that doesn't depend on applause. Confidence that isn't fed by glances. Value that exists even when no one is watching. Man who frees himself from the need for female validation doesn't become cold. He becomes sovereign because he no longer lives to be chosen. He lives to be authentic. And that is rare. It's uncomfortable. It's revolutionary. Jung would say that the man who stops looking for the reflection of desire in a woman's eyes is finally looking inward. And that gaze inward is the beginning of freedom. Carl Jung believed the soul of a man matures when he turns within. And that process of maturation he called individuation. It's not about isolating from the world or rejecting pleasure. It's about integrating all parts of yourself, even the ones you've spent a lifetime trying to hide. In that context, voluntary celibacy is not repression. It's a conscious choice. It's a man deciding, for a time or a season, to step away from sex, to observe who he is without it, without the dopamine, without the adrenaline, without the thrill of the chase. It's a radical decision in a world addicted to distraction. During that time, the man faces something frightening: himself, his contradictions, his voids, his deepest desires. But he also discovers something that frees him: the ability to be enough, to experience joy without needing bodies, to feel desire without falling into dependency. Jung said, individuation isn't a path for everyone because it takes courage. It takes entering unknown internal territory. It takes enduring the silence, and silence is where the truth speaks. Voluntary celibacy, when practiced with awareness, becomes a rite of passage, a deep dive where a man stops seeking women to feel like a man and begins seeking himself to become whole. This phase isn't forever. It's not a vow of eternal abstinence. It's a pause, a sacred time where you choose not to run from yourself, where you learn to redirect your sexual energy, to create, to evolve, to heal. And the man who goes through that process comes out different, more aware, stronger, more whole. Because he discovered something that few have the courage to find: who he really is, without having to prove it to anyone. The human mind is terrified of emptiness, and when the body enters abstinence, the mind starts filling the space with fantasies. Not just erotic dreams or sensual memories, but idealizations, projections, stories created to soothe the feeling of absence. A man who hasn't had sex in a while may, often without noticing, turn any interaction with a woman into a promise. A glance becomes hope. A smile becomes a possibility. A kind gesture becomes a full-blown romance in his head. This happens because desire, when not consciously channeled, seeps into the cracks of the mind and shows up as illusion. Jung said the unconscious is cunning. It will use symbols, images, and people to express what's been repressed. And sexual longing is one of the most manipulative forces when ignored. The danger is this: the man starts falling in love with ghosts, not with real women, but with versions created by his own loneliness. He doesn't see her as she is. He sees what he needs her to be, just to feel complete again. These hallucinations aren't sins, they're symptoms. Symptoms of an imbalance that goes way beyond sex. They reflect emotional dependency disguised as desire. And the longer a man avoids facing that emotional hunger, the more enslaved he becomes by the stories he tells himself. The abstinent mind must be guided. It needs discipline, presence, and truth. Because if left unchecked, it builds castles on top of nothing. And those castles always collapse. That's why the abstinent man must watch his thoughts, with kindness, but also with firmness. He must notice when he's idealizing, projecting, creating inner love stories to avoid the present moment. This is one of the greatest dangers of silence, fantasy, and the antidote is presence. Being here, now, with everything you're feeling, without turning every woman into a rescue mission, without turning every absence into a tragedy. Carl Jung didn't just speak of repression of instincts, he spoke of transmutation, of transformation. He believed sexual energy, libido, didn't need to be eliminated. It needed to be redirected. Society taught us that the only valid outlet for desire is sex. But Jung saw libido as vital energy, creative, spiritual, something that, when well directed, could be used to build, imagine, express, create art, start businesses, transcend. Conscious abstinence reveals this. When a man stops compulsively releasing his energy through sex, he feels a buildup, a tension, and that discomfort is actually a sign of power, of available energy. And then comes the question, what will you do with it? Some men rediscover writing, others dive into projects, learn new skills, deepen their spirituality. The energy once spent chasing pleasure now becomes fuel for achievement, for purpose. This isn't about denying sex, it's about freeing yourself from dependence. It's about no longer being a slave to impulse and becoming the master of your own power. To transmute is to turn desire into direction. Jung used to say that when a man lacks a higher purpose for his energy, he becomes a servant to his instincts. But once he finds that purpose, he rises. Libido doesn't disappear. It becomes refined, and that refinement is what separates the man who merely survives from the one who builds something extraordinary. Through this process, a man discovers that his masculinity isn't defined by how much sex he has, but by how well he channels that energy into something meaningful, something that creates impact, that builds something greater than himself. This reconfiguration of desire becomes a turning point. It's where the man stops being guided by immediate pleasure and starts being led by long-term vision. A vision born from within, from silence, from abstinence, from transformation. When sex stops being the center of a man's life, relationships transform. They lose the weight of expectation. They lose the urgency of conquest. And finally, they begin to breathe. Most men grew up believing that love and desire are inseparable, that you can only love what you desire. But Jung warned, confusing attraction with love is the root of much suffering, because desire is unstable. It's volatile. True love, however, is born from another place, from recognition, acceptance, and deep communion. A man who's gone through conscious abstinence discovers this in real life. He realizes he can love without needing to possess. He can admire without having to conquer. He can connect without losing himself. In this new space, the woman is no longer a source of validation. She becomes a presence, a soul in dialogue with his. And that changes everything, because now there's room for truth, for listening, for real exchange. The man who no longer depends on a woman's approval to feel whole finally becomes capable of loving freely. He doesn't demand, he offers. He doesn't beg, he chooses. He doesn't drain, he shares. And from this posture is born a new kind of relationship, one not driven by lack, but by abundance, not born from emotional hunger, but from conscious choice. A love that doesn't suffocate, but sets you free. Jung called this the symbolic union, when two souls meet, not to fill what's missing, but to celebrate what overflows. And that's only possible when a man heals the dependence that desire once created. Sex still exists, but now it's expression, not emptiness. It's celebration, not addiction. And that shift changes everything. Because the man has finally stopped looking out there for what he could only find within. After the storm comes the calm. But it's not a fragile calm built on distractions or forced distance. It's a peace born from truth, from presence, from accepting yourself without masks. The man who's gone through conscious abstinence discovers something rare. The silence that once scared him now sustains him. He no longer needs constant stimulation to feel alive. He no longer needs excitement to feel connected. He's learned to be with himself, and that changes everything. Jung said that true freedom comes from self-knowledge, and when the mind is no longer driven by unconscious impulses, it becomes an ally, not an enemy. A peaceful mind isn't a mind without desire, it's a mind not ruled by it. At this point, the absence of sex is no longer suffering, it's strength, because it reveals that you are no longer a hostage of biology, nor of ego, nor of culture. You are the author of yourself, and that kind of freedom can't be bought, it can't be taught, it must be lived. This is where mature masculinity is born, not defined by performance, but by consciousness, not seeking power over others, but mastery over self. The man who arrives here becomes an example, not because he's perfect, but because he's present. He no longer needs to prove anything. He no longer seeks to be accepted. He walks lightly because he's no longer carrying the weight of the search. He found what he was looking for, and it was inside. A peaceful mind isn't the end of the journey. It's the beginning of a new life. A life guided by purpose, by clarity, by authenticity, and perhaps the greatest gift of this entire journey is finally being able to look in the mirror and recognize yourself. Whole, enough, free. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you has already begun to awaken. Maybe you don't know what it is yet. Maybe you just felt that something wasn't quite right in how you've been living. But the very act of questioning is already a sign of consciousness. And consciousness is the first step to freedom. Jung used to say, "Who looks outside dreams, but who looks inside awakens." And this video was just that, an invitation to awaken. Not a moral, religious, or repressive path, but a path of truth, of honesty with yourself, of courage, to face your shadow and choose not to be ruled by it anymore. Stopping sex by itself is not the solution, but it's a portal, a space for pause, for cleansing, for observation, a moment where you remove the noise from your mind and finally hear what it's been trying to tell you for years. Most men live chasing validation, pleasure, distraction, always feeling one date, one kiss, one body away from happiness. But the kind of happiness that matters isn't the one you chase, it's the one you build, and that only happens when you stop, when you look inside. This is the real calling, the inner journey, the search for yourself, not to become perfect, but to become whole, not to reject sex, but to master yourself, to no longer live as a prisoner of what the world expects from you, but aligned with what your soul truly needs. If this video touched you, challenged you, or made you reflect, share it. Not because you agree with everything, but because you felt something, and that feeling is the start of the path. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Here, we're not looking for followers, we're looking for awakened men. And if you've made it this far, you are no longer the same man who started watching. See you in the next video, and remember, the real revolution begins the moment you stop running from yourself.